Can you hear me? All right, cool. Hey everyone, thanks for the four people that showed up. I would like to talk for a bit about the journalists and the threats they're facing. Um, I'm Jurre van Bergen. I'm an IT security analyst for OCCRP, which stands for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. We're an organization with their headquarters in Sarajevo. We do cross-border investigations into organized crime and corruption. I'm also a co-maintainer of this thing called OTR, which stands for off-the-record messaging. I'd like to say hi to my Ecuadorian comrades who might be watching this. And we're also hiring in case you're interested. So OCCRP, as I said, it's Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. We have our headquarters in Sarajevo, but we're based in 40 more countries around the world. We do a lot of cross-border investigations into corruption, as corruption, when you do really high-level corruption with a lot of money involved, you probably need a bank or any kind of other entity in another country to make that possible, like tax havens or European banks, for example. Some of those noteworthy investigations, some of you might remember, are like the Azerbaijani laundromat. There was basically a scheme by high-level officials in the Azerbaijani government using European banks and other institutions to launder around $2.7 billion, actually. Let's see if I can actually give you kind of overview of that. So it was a complex money laundering operation, a slush fund that handled $2.9 billion over a 2-year period through 4 shell companies registered in the UK. Which have been uncovered by joint investigations by a bunch of journalists and organizations across the world, from Denmark, OCCRP, so Deutsche Zeitung, Le Monde, The Tide in Belgium, Novaya Gazeta in Russia, for example, and a bunch of others. So that's one of those. It's sort of interesting as it has a lot of like a local connection here, as Danske Bank had their brands in Estonia, and they sort of turned a blind eye to a bunch of these transactions, as they were already warned in 2000, I think in 2017, but also before that, that they were sort of facilitating and didn't have a good check and balances within the organization to make to sort of stop these practices from happening. Another one is the Great Gambia heist that we published this year. This is a really interesting story. It's from one of the former presidents called Yahya Jammeh that ruled over Gambia. And he took over power in 1994 using coup d'etat. He was sort of, he cracked down on a bunch of people, basically. And then he had this bizarre personality that sort of drew headlines where he gave himself 5 titles and claimed to be able to cure AIDS and stuff like that. And then, of course, he gained a lot of wealth. But people never really knew how much wealth and where that wealth went to. Until now. So there's like a bunch of information we got that we published where I think the amount of laundering was around like $1 billion. And that went through from Gambia to China to Hezbollah, as far as I understood from the story. So if you're to the Hezbollah laundromat, it's a super bizarre story. I really, if you want to read a really bizarre story, I would definitely check that one out. And then there was this other laundromat that happened this year that we published called the Troika laundromat. is basically, again, let's see where I have it. This one, basically, it's a bunch of corrupt politicians and organized crime figures, for example, like either connected to the Kremlin or like the FSB that use European banks to launder a bunch of money, again, through Danske Bank, for example. So yeah, it's a good story. It's on our front page in the top. Of course, it's not really gonna load. No thanks. This one. All right. So we actually gave them an award last year for being the most corrupt actor of the year, as they've sort of facilitated a bunch of money laundering schemes from all across the world, basically. And now there's an investigation that's sort of, in total, is $270 billion worth of transactions that are under investigation at the moment. So I guess the sort of summary is that we published and found out through a source that gave us the information there was money bouncing between this particular branch of the Estonian Danske Bank that went through several companies in Europe. In London, they were sort of dormant, but they were not actually dormant, as they were doing like, you know, hundreds of millions of, or tens of millions of transactions each day. Or the worth was several tens of millions. Super bizarre. So when you do this sort of reporting, people tend to get upset as you sort of like dry up their money laundering scheme. So like, what do sort of people think that the sort of threats that we might face? Don't be shy. Yeah, death is definitely one of them. Yeah, and I think it's actually more physical almost, or more harassment than actually like technology-wise, which is not entirely unsurprising. I guess it's easier to, you know, intimidate somebody than like using some kind of expensive operation to try to compromise them. And so there's this thing where people would just sort of say like, use Signal and use Tor. I think that's, I don't think a lot of people know, but like the use Signal, use Tor was sort of used as a meme, as the sort of security advice that people tend to give. But also like that doesn't really fly with us, right? As we do reporting from like, Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan to Sudan to Gambia and other parts of South America. So we have all kinds of like different continents with very different threat models. Well, I guess in Europe, most of the time, at least in Western Europe, you won't really, you might end up in some kind of court case. But in Sudan, that might mean that you might, get killed or something like that. So there's very different threat models involved. So actually something that happened this month was Bivol, our Bulgarian partner, got this European investigation order submitted towards them. Sort of days after they ordered the Bulgarian anti-corruption chief. They had to resign following an investigation by them. They've been accused of sort of like cyber terrorism, where the framing that the government was using was that there was this leaked Telegram chat where they would turn on the water sprinklers in the politician's office to water them. And they made up this claim because some of the people living elsewhere, they used this European investigation order to maybe try to get to their server and stuff. So that's like some of the recent threats that we do. And then there's this other one where a journalist, Pavel Sheremet from Belarus was killed in a car bomb in Ukraine in the morning after he might have upset some people with some of the reporting that he did. And the Ukrainian police and investigation and government wasn't really keen on like investigating the entire murder. And so OCCRP together with Schlitzohr made a reconstruction on that, and that resulted in a documentary called Killing Pavel, where they made a complete reconstruction of what might actually has happened during that time. You can find it on our website if you want to look how that happened. So, you know, there's like sort of Fox investigation orders sort of misused against journalism, or like, you know, murder and stuff like that. But then there's also the online threats. And actually, I guess the online threats are almost cuter in a way. Of course, like, it's a lot easier to phish journalists or people in general. I guess there's not much of a difference between like other targeting of companies or organizations. So I think actually this week, CyberConnect and some other researchers found out that they made a complete clone of like Proton Mail and trying to phish people like that. Mainly journalists targeting, you know, the Kremlin or Russia. And so people have been saying that maybe it's like, you know, attribution is hard anyway. But as they have been investigating mostly Russia-based things, sort of they started pointing towards Russia. I mean, we see this as well quite a lot, is that phishing is definitely the #1 attack factor. Luckily, sort of two-factor authentication and training helps quite a bit. They've not really been, I mean, it's always hard, right? I mean, in general, I don't think it definitely helps that you have two-factor authentication. It's not, you know, I mean, look at the DNC hack, but I think they still went through the two-factor authentication, but it's definitely a huge. The second factor of, I think, the Gmail thing for. No, it's not SMS. It's actually like Google Authenticator. So that's TOTP, right? Yeah. So it's definitely the TOTP. We definitely do not encourage SMS 2FA. We explicitly disable that. As apparently still getting access to SS7 is apparently rather easy. So I'd rather not be targeted by that. Also DDoS attacks. So we don't really like Cloudflare. Because of that, we have somewhat of our own caching infrastructure built. It's open source. It's sort of like a bunch of Nginx running across multiple providers around the world that do caching of the front end with a sort of like a couple hour long cache. Which is actually open source in our GitLab. I would definitely be interested if people run or have hosting providers here and they would like to help out with this. I'd really like to talk with you if you have any spare bandwidth for this. Some other stuff we created was we tend to do a lot of conferences. And we don't necessarily trust the Wi-Fi there, so we bring our own routers together with OpenWRT. We deploy WireGuard on them. That's completely open source. It's automated through SaltStack, which I guess is just another Puppet with an agent running. You can get it from our GitLab. Then this malware threat thing. I think this is actually an interesting one, as journalists sort of, their job is to receive information. And then we, of course, train a lot of people when they sort of join the organization into like, how do you set them up with like two-factor authentication, or with TOTP and stuff like that, password managers, and but then you get to the thing like what if journalists obtain any kind of documents, right? And they click on it and start watching the files, then they might have already clicked on it on their workstation, and then how do you deal with that? So most of the time, if we get files, like really a large amount of files, we do it through different means where we do some conversion of the data to make it at least slightly safer. So hopefully, the malicious bits are actually gone from the documents. But that's not always the case. So we tend to sometimes review some of the laptops of people. And training at least sort of works here, is that even if they get this email out of the blue from somebody offering information, then they normally sort of go to the security team and be like, hey, I got this thing that seems kind of weird. I was not expecting any kind of information. Could you check it? And then sometimes, it's actually malware. But sometimes, it's not actually targeted malware. It's actually just a banking Trojan that they got. So, you don't only have the targeted sort of malware. It's also just like the general like banking or ransomware stuff that gets sent around to them. Then there's a lot of the document threats. So some of you might remember the reality winner case with the printer dots and stuff like that. We created some kind of policy a while ago, like, what are some of the threats and how can you sort of, do some of the countermeasures with that. How can you actually check for yourself if there's any printer dots available, right? So I'm not sure if I have an example that I can show. Let's see. Maybe here. Reality winner. Right. I'd like to document cloud link, I guess. Oh. So I don't know the exact timeline from the top of my head, but I think the Intercept published the document online with the printer dots already available without sort of turning it into another document. So the printer dots would no longer be available. I think from that thing on, the job that she worked at could go back and see like who had accessed this document. And I think she was one of the 6 or 7 culprits, so to say, of like who accessed the documents. And then because she also had accessed the intercepts from her workstation, I think that gave her to be like the prime suspect of this leak in general, as far as I remember. Right, yeah, and the Intercept also gave the exact document to the NSA for comment. Yeah. Right, then there's all the metadata. So even though we turn all the documents into new documents, there's always some documents that will still have some metadata because they're like part of a really small dump that we got. And so that's the people that created math 2. that's this sort of metadata removal tool. That's pretty nice. And it removes a lot of metadata from like a bunch of file formats, from like doc, docx, ODT. I think a bunch of other things like sorry. Images, I think also some other file formats like music file formats and video file formats. That works really well. It's again, it's not a fail-safe method, as you sort of have to check if that file format is like, is it better to just sort of trans or like re-encode that original file format to a new full file format just to sort of obscure where the documents might have come from, right? As I think, for example, there was a case in the Netherlands a long time ago where there was a document about the Iraq war investigation leaks. And it seems like the sort of Dutch Secret Service wanted to have like a suspect inside that was their own person. And they were convinced that the document came from one of the people at the Secret Service, except that this document was also shared at different ministries. So they say, well, it's a state secret. It must have come from somebody within the Secret Service. But it seemed like she was definitely not the person who leaked the document, as so many other people had access to it, and they were not actually even investigated. That's interesting stuff. Then you have the Canary traps, right? So this is the sort of thing where you add any kind of like extra paragraph in each copy that you give to, for example, if you have a committee, you give each and every one a sort of copy of the same document, but you add one extra paragraph. So if one copy ever leaks, you can actually find out who you gave it to, and then that must have been actually the suspect of the person leaking it. That's sort of hard to, I guess, protect against. Then I guess you can protect against it by, maybe not actually publishing the full document, but sort of quoting from it. But that sort of might have actually harmed the reporting on it and the trustworthiness of it. So that's sort of up to the editors on like how to, how do you balance the reporting out with stuff like that. Then there's this thing called zero-width characters, where if you would it's sort of invisible to the eye, but if you would copy it from a document, you can sort of see it. And normally, if you would copy that to another editor, it would not appear. But if you would actually copy it to, something like a terminal, you can actually see that it adds, like you can sort of copy. It will sort of look like, here I have like a conversion of fresh data before analyzing, and within that same sentence, another sentence would appear like, oh, it's actually like, Jane Doe who has leaked the document. And then, there's the conversion of fresh data before analyzing that we ever get in large quantities. Then you have stuff like events in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan did this weird man in the middle where people would get man in the middle and they would be asked on mobile providers with text messages to install this CA system. So if they would go to like Facebook.com, then it would appear as if it's HTTPS, but they had installed the CA. So the Kazakh state was actually man in the middling it. Apparently, it's been on hold for now, as they've been saying that it was a sort of like successful pilot thing that they did. I'm not entirely convinced it's gone. I think what's been happening is that they do not have enough equipment to do the man in the middle for the entire country, or even to process the data. And it seems that there's been providers buying like 40-gate products to make this possible. The provider, I think, of that was Beeline in Kazakhstan. So I think there's a bunch of people just buying a bunch of equipment, and then they're going to up the processing power of the system. And I think it's going to probably be back in full swing, maybe 6 months or like a year from now on. I don't think this is the last we will hear from that. And you know, it will be really interesting to know which manufacturers are aiding this behavior. As you know, we have journalists in Kazakhstan, and we would really like to know, you know, who the companies are aiding this. Then we do a bunch of pen testing. So we do a bunch of penetration testing of new applications before actually launching them. That has to do also with like if people make any kind of search engine to deal with leaked information that journalists can go through. We hope to, you know, increase the amount of penetration testing also commercially when it comes to, you know, auditing really large stuff. For example, we have a really big data search engine, data.OCCRP.org, that has like, you know, a bunch of data on there, and we really like to keep it safe. So it's these sort of things that we'd like to really protect against for being compromised, just really. So, you know, in case you ever get compromised, there's a bunch of actors that are targeting sort of the stuff in this sphere of like, you know, if you tend to investigate Troika laundromats, you make interesting enemies. And some of these threat actors tend to reuse IPs for domains for phishing when you point them to. So it's always sort of interesting to look at like domains and IPs used in the past and see if they ever change IP address, or like sort of hosting companies that they tend to go to all the time. So through you know, passive DNS and some other tricks, you can sort of maybe figure out attacks before they actually happen. As some of these actors tend to, you know, register a domain like 6 months before they actually use it. So there's a bit of time before you could actually like, you know, take some of it down, or like if you detect them, revoke any kind of SSL certificates. I actually I managed to revoke one certificate, I think a month ago, that was targeting one of our journalists in like, that was impersonating a major US email provider. And they took it down within a couple hours. So that was kind of nice. And then, you know, with that, you can monitor SSL certificates with certificate transparency, which is kind of super useful. I think another really nice tool that I use a lot in investigations like that is Passive Total. They have like this huge like resource of like terabytes and terabytes of data, where you could actually use a domain and you could see like all the sort of like WUIs that it went through in the last couple of years. So I was, I think, investigating a domain yesterday. You could sort of put it in, and then you could see that it changed ownership 3 times, or like somebody just updated the WUIs details to be, I think, like actually a fake person. And you know, that was just through a Passive Total where you could do that. So it's really nice. In the community version, you get like 20 or 25 free queries a day. So I would definitely, if you want to have fun with that, check it out. And then collaboration. So NGOs tend to have the same kind of enemies, I guess. And so there's some collaboration on info sharing about people getting compromised, or like if they're compromising one specific kind of NGO that does, you know, investigations in the same kind of realm or sphere. We tend to help each other out with some collaboration and information. And then it's always good to have friends who are a lot better in malware reversing than I am. So there's been people that we can actually poke, and they will actually help out with some malware reversing if we ever get very interesting samples that we sometimes get. There's some other solutions. There's some network monitoring. So there's some network monitoring in. So I guess it's sort of interesting, right? So I guess in most networks, in like business networks, if you would ever see Tor, I guess that's kind of sketchy. For a journalist newsroom, like using Tor is not very sketchy. So you need to adjust any kind of network monitoring quite often as to sort of allow these sort of things to actually go through and not raise any sort of alarm. But then you get maybe into the thing where what happens if a threat actor actually launches a static binary of Tor and then uses that to actually trade a bunch of stuff. So it's sort of a, that's stuff that I'm sort of battling with a little bit sometimes. And then we do a lot of training with the people with the journalist in question, but we also training the help desk people on like how they could help with like possible redactions of documents or conversion or how to detect phishing emails and train them into giving us as much information as possible so we can actually look if it's either a legit email or an actual phishing email or something like that. And other collaborations, as I was speaking about. So how can you help? I'd really love to connect with technologists from around the world, mainly in like Eastern Europe and Central Asia. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there, for example, with Kazakhstan. So if you ever know any kind of people there, I would really love to talk about them. I guess also like anti-censorship publishing technologies. So even if we would publish any kind of information, it would be really nice if it doesn't really go offline for a long time. If you are a person in an IT stack team of other NGOs, I'd also really love to talk about you, maybe do some knowledge sharing or other stuff. Then they got data. Most investigations start with a leak, as you might imagine. And if you have any other ideas, I'll be happy to talk about them. Maybe not on camera, but then that's sort of my talk. It's hard to sometimes be very concrete about some of the security stuff that you do, as we live in very interesting times. But I'm happy to answer any questions while I'm here, if anyone has questions.